Hey everybody, Chris here from It's Mead Made. Today I am going to be showing you my entire process of how I paint this Venom takeover of Spider-Man. This model comes in the welcome pack of the Chibi STL Patreon. If you're interested in getting this model, I'll put a link in the description below for you. But other than that, let's go ahead and get into this video. So after I've processed my models, the next step is to prime my models. And I'm not priming everything the exact same color. So for Spider-Man and all of his pieces, I'm actually priming it the Vallejo white surface primer. That way I have a good foundation to put on some of those brighter colors for the Spider-Man suit. But then for the Venom head and for the base, I'm painting it the black Vallejo surface primer. Once I'm done with that, then I'm going to take Spider-Man's head and actually spray in black primer over all of the eyes. And the reason I'm doing that is because now I'm going to go back over it with some of my Liquitex white acrylic ink. And it's so thin I can just put it directly into my airbrush without having to worry about thinning it down. Then I'm going to take my Badger airbrush with a finer nozzle point and lightly spray in the center of his eyes, and I just slowly move out to be able to create a really nice gradient on the whites of his eyes. After I'm done with Spider-Man, then I take the Venom head and do the exact same thing. The key to this is just doing light coats. Do not overdo it on the first pass, so it just takes a lot of back and forth with just a very small amount. And the big key here is I'm not worried about overspray in any way, because everywhere the overspray is going, I'm going to be painting back over it. After I have all the priming done, it's time to move to some color. And I'm going to be using this Army Painter's Crusted Sore Red. And what this is going to be for is inside Venom's mouth, because I want it a really dark red. And I've already thinned it down in a separate cup so I can just pour it directly into my airbrush. They say hindsight is 20/20. I really wish I would have masked off the eyes before I actually started painting, because my glove was a little wet and it reactivated that white ink and it kind of messed it up. But it was a very quick fix. I just re-hit it with the white ink and you couldn't even tell anything ever happened. Once I was done with that, it was time to move to Spider-Man, and I'm using this bloody red Game Air from Vallejo. The great thing about Game Air colors is you can just pour them directly into your airbrush because they're meant for airbrush. And I also learned my lesson with Venom and masked off Spider-Man's eyes. And all I used to mask his eyes off was some silly putty. And while I had that red available, I went ahead and painted everything on Spider-Man's suit that is red. After the red was done, I switched to this Scarlet Red from Game Air. So there was just a few areas on the red that I was just hitting it to make it just a little bit darker. And I especially focused this color on the head, since his head is in Venom's mouth, to make it a little darker. The last thing I had was the blue of his suit, and I'm using this Magic Blue from Game Color. For his legs, he had one foot that I already painted red, so I just covered that up with silly putty as a quick mask, and I'll do touch-up with a paintbrush later. And then for the torso, there were certain areas that I could get the blue easily without worrying about too much overspray, so I just hit that. And then any remaining areas, I'll just get with a brush. So here you can see everything I was able to accomplish with just the airbrush. Now the rest of the work is all going to be brush work. Alright, so I have everything airbrushed that I want to be airbrushed, and for this project I'm going to be using my Vallejo Game Color paints. I love the Vallejo Game Color line just because of how vibrant their colors are, and I think it'll really pop just because of the amount of black that's in this model, so having these bright colors stand out. So for these paints I'm going to be using my wet palette, and I'm putting a new sheet on. And if you've never used a wet palette before, or if you're unfamiliar, what it is it's got this sponge on it, and then you basically have this like wax paper or parchment paper that you put over it. But first I like to get my wet palette nice and wet. So what I do is I just get it really saturated. So essentially you want enough water on there to where it starts to pool. Then I just pour the remaining water out. So there we go. So once it's nice and wet, I just take my parchment paper and I just lay it down on there and make sure it doesn't wrinkle. And there we go. So the nice thing about this is using a wet palette, I do not have to use water to thin my paints because the water actually wicks up through the parchment paper and thins them for me. So the first thing I'm going to be using is I'm going to use the Game Color Magic Blue. Because this is the exact same color as the blue, I use the Game Air, which is the same exact paint except for it's ready for an airbrush. So I'm going to go ahead and just put a few drops down and get to painting all of the blue that I could not get with the airbrush. And I've also already glued this together because I just wanted to have one solid piece because there was no benefit of having them separate at this point. And get my wonderful magnifying glasses so I can actually see. Alright, I'm going to use this bloody red from Game Color, and I've just got a little bit of touch up to do. So I went ahead and painted the boot white, and that is to help me when I paint the red on next. And when you're painting lighter colors like reds, oranges, and yellows, it's always smart to do a base coat of white, and that is why I did the base coat of white here, just because everything shows through a lot easier. So I did the same thing, and now I'm just going to paint this boot red. Now I have to do the exact same thing to the tongue. I am going to go ahead and paint this whole thing white. So let me just do that and we'll skip to the next part. I went ahead and skipped forward and painted the tongue white. So the next thing I'm going to do is I am going to paint this squid pink on the tongue, because I want it a really bright pink. So I'm gonna go ahead with this one. So I'm gonna put a little on my wet palette. So I'm gonna go ahead and just get started painting this pink. All right, now that I got the tongue, the last few things I'm going to have to do is the teeth, and then obviously kind of the slime around his tongue. But before I do the teeth, what I want to do is I actually want to paint an edge around his mouth, so kind of his lips. And what I'm going to use for this is this Warlord purple, just to kind of let it stand out a little more on the edges of his lips. Alright, so now I have the gums all painted, and if you notice that I wasn't too concerned with the edges because I'm going to be painting all of this black again, so it really doesn't matter if I come over on these edges. And that's the big thing, is when you're painting these kind of things, you want to realize, well, what's my next layer? And will it cover it up? Do I have to worry about that edge line? So like, for example, the green here, I did not care that the slime got pink on it because I'm going to be covering it up again. I really want that to dry, so now I'm going to move over here and start painting the black on Spider-Man. And all of these lines, as well as all of these lines. For the lines, I'm just going to be using black from Game Color. So I'm just going to put a little on my board, and I'm going to be using a very fine point brush because this is going to be a lot of edges. All right, so the one thing I am doing is I'm looking at to see how much do I actually have to paint. But do I have to paint all of the spider web if you're never going to see the back of it? So I've just got to do a little bit more on the top and around the back, and then I am going to call myself done because I genuinely don't want to paint all of that. Okay, so I've got that 100% done, and by 100% I mean what I actually need to paint. Let me fix this. Because I would encourage you not to paint every single thing when you never see it, unless you really like painting. So this is done. I'm gonna set this aside now. And now all of the edges on the suit. Now, unfortunately, I've got to paint every bit of it. All right, so now I have all of the lining done on Spider-Man for his body. So the next thing I have to do is Venom, and where he's overtaking Spider-Man. And what I'm going to be using for that is this multi-surface licorice, and this is from Folk Art. So I've been using a lot of my better paints for this, but when it comes down to the black, I definitely want a finish satin, and that is not quite glossy, but not matte. And I think that would be a really cool thing for this Venom overtaking him everywhere. So I'm still going to be thinning these down, and I'm going to go ahead and use my wet palette for this, because there's no rule saying, you know, you could only have the nicer paints for a wet palette. You can definitely use just regular acrylic paints for a wet palette too. So now I'm going to go ahead and paint the head the color of this licorice satin Folk Art paint. So now for the teeth, and what I'm going to be using is this bone white from Game Color. Okay, so now I have the teeth all done, and it's time to work on this, I guess, slime all over his tongue. And for the slime, I'm going to be using this Escorpina green from Game Color. So I noticed I got some black marks on here from putting him on the base and testing it, but that's okay because I plan on painting the sole of his foot a darker red. I'm going to go ahead and use this Gore Red, and it is thinned down because it is a Game Air. So I'm just going to put a drop in here and start painting it. Alright, so the very last thing I decided I wanted to do, because of it's his tongue and it's kind of like looks slimy, I want to give it a really cool glossy texture. So I'm going to go ahead and use my gloss top coat for my airbrush, Now this is for an airbrush, and that just means it's thinned down for an airbrush. There's nothing stopping you from actually applying it with a brush. So I'm going to go ahead and pour some in my paint tray. Then I'm going to take a brush and coat this to get it really glossy and wet looking, because, you know, it really needs to be. Alright, so I gave a really thick coat to where it was just dripping, and I'm going to just let it dry like that to where I can have some like clear slime kind of coming off of his tongue. So I'm going to go ahead and let this tongue dry, then I'm going to assemble it and glue it together, and that will be it. So here's the model when I first started, and here is the results. I am so happy with how this thing turned out. It was a lot of fun to paint, well, all except the webbing of Spider-Man. That was a little bit tedious, but overall, I still think it turned out great. It's a really fun model, and it's just really cool of him just overtaking Spider-Man. Real quick though, I just want to say thank you to all of the people that have supported me on Patreon this month. If you want to be like these awesome people, you get exclusive access to my private Discord channels, as well as seeing all of my behind the scenes. I'll go ahead and put a link below if you're interested. Thanks a lot for watching, and I hope you have a great day. Other than that, I'll see you in that next video.